Welcome to the Subverse. I'm your host, Susan Mathews. This is a podcast where we journey from the cosmic to the quantum and from cells to cities. In this episode, we are going on a roller coaster ride, spanning Earth and space, a crossover of elements. My guest is Dr. Craig Walton, a planetary scientist based at ETH Zürich and the University of Cambridge. Craig's work spans the origins, evolution, and distribution of life in the universe. I chatted with Craig about cosmic dust and the origins of life on Earth, specifically early Earth chemistry. Bioessential elements such as phosphorus, sulfur, nitrogen, and carbon were not abundant on terrestrial rock, and the theory goes that they were helped along by prebiotic chemicals appearing in asteroids and comets. But beyond big asteroid impacts, a new study published in Nature Astronomy earlier this year by Craig and other colleagues show how cosmic dust helps seed young Earth and may have made all the difference. Up to 40,000 tons of cosmic dust falls to Earth every year. Billions of years ago, that number would have been 10 to 10,000 times higher. In the study, they found that the most promising environments to spread this dust and fertilize the Earth were probably glaciers, both because they could trap high amounts of dust and because they have very little contamination from terrestrial dirt. Apart from this peek at early Earth chemistry and geology, with some cosmic dust sprinkled in, we also discussed meteorites and their significance and durability, holding the hull of the most extensive sea of time, expelled from a cosmic forge, surviving gravity. We finally moved on to phosphorus, a key element for life, known as the bringer of the light of day, and also by its more fiendish nickname, the devil's element. The devil here may be in the details, and through understanding this element further, we discussed what the origins and persistence of life on Earth can tell us about humanity's place in the cosmos. For me, this conversation just reminded me again how unbelievably lucky we are to have Earth as our home, but also that it may be the kindness of space outsiders, such as cosmic dust, that helps seed and fertilize what we call home. It clearly takes a cosmic village to make a planet. And what do we do with these cosmic gifts, such as phosphorus? Well, listen to this conversation to hear the rest. Craig, let me start by giving you a very warm welcome to the Subverse. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Susan. It's great to be here.
You recently published a paper along with other scholars in Nature Astronomy. In this paper, you seek to uncover the origins of life on Earth. It's a really lovely paper. I spent some time reading it in the last 2 weeks. In studying our Earth rocks, what you found is that they are relatively poor in reactive and soluble forms of key elements such as phosphorus, sulfur, nitrogen, and carbon. So it's almost like we have a mineral deficiency. All of these elements are so essential for life. So in the paper, the question that you try to answer is, where did these bioessential elements come from if we had the deficiency already on Earth? The paper then posits that apart from the impact of meteorites and asteroids, one such possibility by which these bioessential elements found their way to Earth was by cosmic dust. It's a paper which is already upending earlier theories and challenging status quo. So please share with us the key findings. To start with, what exactly is cosmic dust that plays such a starring role in the story?
Yes, fantastic opening question. So, cosmic dust is simply the finest particle size of material that's falling to Earth from space each year. So, people are quite familiar with the idea of meteorites, which are larger objects that you might find once they've arrived at the surface. And people have heard of asteroids, like the object that came in and killed the dinosaurs, according to our best evidence. And cosmic dust is just the finest sub 3 millimeter size category of material. So compositionally, it's very similar to those bigger objects. But the fact of the matter is, it has so many advantages over those bigger things. So, for example, per year, it's the largest amount of mass of material falling to Earth each year. It comes in the form of cosmic dust. And it makes it through the atmosphere almost unscathed because it doesn't heat up as much. It sort of drifts through the atmosphere rather than almost melting. A lot of these larger objects either explode on impact or they vaporize as they fall through the atmosphere. Cosmic dust just makes it through very gently. And that means that all those nice elements for life that you mentioned, the carbon and the nitrogen, the phosphorus, they stay in their original states and they stay at high concentrations rather than being lost into the atmosphere, volatilized into a cloud on impact. And there are many reasons that we want to think about stuff from space in the context of origins of life. So maybe I'll just touch on that for a moment. Why do we care about this? You mentioned that terrestrial rocks are poor in these elements. And generally speaking, this is true for all planets. Because when you build a planet from the dust, originally, that forms a solar system, that collapses along with a bunch of gas to form a star, in the process of building a planet, though that dust changes its chemical composition. If you imagine you end up forming a magma ocean, you have all these collisions between asteroids as you're building the planet up, and much like what happens to particles as they pass through an atmosphere, you lose the carbon, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and the sulfur. And not only that, a lot of the phosphorus and the sulfur and the carbon actually go into the core because we have a big metal core at the center of the Earth. And that's inevitably going to happen in forming planets. And you will extract certain elements that bond with iron into the core. And so basically what you end up with is a surface, a planetary surface, which is horribly, inhospitable and deficient, as you say, in things you need for life and the things that our bodies are using up each day and are built from. And yet, if you import some of that original building block, some of that leftover dust, or larger objects, but in my case, I'm thinking about the dust, you can get a concentrated shock of nutrients that are there unperturbed from the formation of the solar system. And yeah, so one of the key reasons as well I was interested in cosmic dust, and one of the reasons people hadn't thought about it previously, is that it seemed that there just wouldn't have been enough arriving in any one location to make it relevant. Like in principle, it would be great. But right now, if you go outside, you're not like terribly worried about being hit on the head by cosmic dust. Like you wouldn't even like think about it. It turns out that it is kind of everywhere. Like on the surface of an old building, if you were able to comb through all the dust particles, you would find some that are cosmic. But when people did calculations, they estimated that if you had a given pond or a lake on the surface of the early Earth, and then you just are depositing dust grains into it, there wouldn't be enough to give you any sensible supply rate of those bioessential elements. What they missed out on was the geology, because I'm a geologist by training, not an astronomer or a chemist. And as we all know, on the surface of the Earth is doing lots of great things to concentrate particles into specific areas. That's how beaches form. These particles come from all over the surface and end up in preferential areas. And the same thing happens to cosmic dust, actually. So maybe we can talk about that next. But there are places on the surface of the Earth where cosmic dust is 10,000 times concentrated relative to the average background. And then when you add in our estimates that we came up with for how much more dust would have been coming in 4.5 billion years ago, which is when we think life on Earth appeared, you predict that these environments should have been completely dominated by cosmic dust. So then you have this constant and really high flux rate supply of cosmic dust to particular locations, and then they become really exciting. So that's kind of the broad logic of the puzzle.
Thank you so much. It's really fascinating. So you've talked about one part of it, which is cosmic dust falling on Earth. And you already alluded to the formation of beaches. And I understand that that's the next part of the paper, that you needed glaciers or some glaciation to essentially spread the dust.
Yes, so to concentrate it, exactly. Yes. So the reason that the glaciers turn out to be so important is that they have many mechanisms active to take your dust and concentrate it into specific locations, which is there when we think maybe the origin of life could have happened in these places. And the reasons for this are twofold. One is that if you imagine the surface of a glacier, there's nothing else happening. There's no other source of sediment. All the sediment generation is happening on the base of the glacier where the erosion is happening. So glaciers generate huge amounts of sediment, but not on the surface. The surface is just ice. And that means you're not diluting your cosmic dust very much with terrestrial sources of sediment. And not only that, the particles can get blown across the surface by the wind and then get trapped into topographic lows. And then what happens is an interesting thing where, because the particles are dark, they heat up more so than the ice. They melt the ice around them and then they sink slightly. And you form these self-sustaining puddles, these lakes. And they're called cryoconite holes. Cryoconite holes. And they can be quite big. They can get up to meters, I think. And then basically, in amongst this icy desert, even today, they form these holes which are full of life and full of cosmic dust. And we estimated how big and how cosmic dust rich these things would have been if you had an ice sheet 4.5 billion years ago. It turns out they would have been like 99.9% filled with cosmic dust, right? Which then becomes weirdly similar to some of the things that the organic chemists do in the lab. I think I'm not sure what your impression of Earth at that time would have been, but in the lab, when people try and do, for example, RNA replication, like the RNA world is still one of the leading ideas for how to get a self-replicating system going. It works really, really well in a nearly frozen environment. And many chemical reactions that we think might be relevant to the origins of life work much better at low temperatures rather than high temperatures. They're much more selective when it's cold. And there's a whole branch of geology now suggesting that the Earth, even if it started off initially with this magma ocean, would quickly have cooled down quite a lot to the point where ice sheets early on are quite plausible. So that's why ice sheets, we know that's where the cosmic dust is today, and they seem actually increasingly plausible early on. And the chemistry suggests that that is kind of useful. So there's a whole set of ideas here fitting together.
So, Craig, I have a question here, which is I've read about thermal vents in the ocean and life forming there, etc. And I wonder how that sort of works now with these theories.
Great question. Yeah. So the main advantage that a hydrothermal vent theory has, and the reason people have been attracted to it for so long, because it's one of the longer standing ideas in the field, is that it has this continuous supply of energy and molecules in a certain location for hundreds of thousands of years. The problem is that you're pumping it into the ocean. Then you dilute anything you've made. So if you make some acetate or some formate, some simple organic molecule, it's going to diffuse into the ocean and then be hydrolyzed, just react with water. I mean, water is actually quite destructive towards many molecules which are relevant to prebiotic chemistry, the chemistry that could have given rise to life. And so even though you have this constant supply rate, the problem that that theory has been unable to overcome so far is that the diffusion, the constant dilution of the things you're making stops you from building complexity. And people have tried to think about, well, maybe we can keep stuff inside the vent, but so far the experiments just aren't really giving us very deeply complex outputs. Meanwhile, experiments don't think about small ponds or lakes, and because you don't lose the things you're making to some huge system, can really build the complexity. And there's been a huge amount of progress with chemistry in those settings recently. However, I think that the learning point here is what you really want is the advantage of both. Because a pond by itself doesn't have that constant input and it can die from starvation, right? But what I'm hoping the next stage of this whole work on the cosmic dust is that we can combine the best of both. Because you have the small pond, but because you have the constant input of dust, you also have the continuous input that was so attractive to the hydrothermal vents. And so I think usually with any big problem in science, there's usually two camps, both have a point, and then you're going to try and find a way to get the best out of both and resolve the problems that the other ones have. So we'll see if it works out that way. It might not be cosmic dust, but I also feel like the hydrothermal vents, they have a point, but I think they also have a big problem. But we'll see.
Here I had a question about cosmic dust itself. What are they made of?
Yes. So there's a huge variety to cosmic dust, just as there's a huge variety to space rocks that fall from outside Earth's atmosphere all the time. The most common tend to be from what are called chondritic meteorites or chondritic asteroids. It's a weird terminology, but basically, how do I explain this? One of the earliest solids to form in the solar system is called chondrules, and they're little spheres, right? So when you put cosmic dust particles and when you put chondritic meteorites under the microscope, you just see a bunch of sort of glowing spheres under your thin section that you've cut. And these things are very mysterious, but we think they formed by the young sun heating and melting particles of dust that were there in the early solar system when it was incredibly active with its radiation. And because it's so early on and didn't go through the planet forming process itself, as I say, they have these high concentrations of elements like phosphorus and carbon and nitrogen, which might otherwise be lost to a core or into space. But you also have particles from comets, because when comets fall towards the sun from further out in the solar system, they start to fragment and break apart. And then you release incredibly carbon and nitrogen rich particles from these. Some of the particles falling to Earth and modeled in our study to contribute at times over 50% of the carbon and nitrogen to the deposits on the surface of the glaciers are coming from comets, because they can be like 90% carbon and nitrogen, which is just insane. And that's because carbon and nitrogen condensed to form solids much more readily further out early on in the solar system where it was colder. Whereas when you're closer to the sun, it stays in the gas and then eventually just gets lost rather than ending up in a rock. And then finally, you do sometimes get stuff from beyond the solar system. You also find pre-solar grains, which, exactly as it says on the tin, are particles that are older than the sun itself. So they come largely from supernova that precede the sun's existence, that generated these really weird minerals, diamonds, carbides, other things, which from their isotopic composition, we know are not from our solar system. And so they're quite rare, but they are intriguing in the sense that they're 10 billion years old, in excess of that. These diamonds that formed under immense pressures and temperatures beyond our solar system. So they're not the most relevant for the origins of life, but they are an incredible resource of information about where the solar system itself came from, the origin of the solar system, not so much the origin of life.
So, Craig, I want to move on to another set of questions, given that this amazing experience both in geology and studying things that are coming in from outer space. And here I wanted to refer to a conversation I had with my previous guest, Professor Katrin Yusuf, where we had a very hard-hitting conversation about the history of geology. I don't want to get into that with you, but I did want to read out a few things she said about meteorites, and I would love to hear your views on this. She quotes Elizabeth Gross, who writes of the meteorite as the ultimate outsider, a cosmological imponderable that might burst through the perceived limits of the known. Yusuf writes that for people who were often subjugated or were enslaved, the cosmic, of which the meteorite is a concentrated reality, was a way to freedom. The meteorite signals the ultimate free territory beyond the propertied forms of Earth and its territorial constraint. It is both cosmic gift and a form of eviscerated metallurgic intensity. I would like to know your thoughts on this and how this shifts what we think of as human or even earthly.
Wow, yeah, that's a big poetic question. It's cool language. Yeah, that's interesting. I did read the question beforehand and I had some thoughts about what it means to me, certainly, these materials, what they say at a sort of deeper level about where we come from and how we should live. I could certainly offer that perspective in a sort of less scientific way. And I guess I have two thoughts. One of which is very Carl Sagan, right? Which is that it's incredible to me that potentially all life derives from cosmic dust or from stuff that came from space. And actually, it's what people have assumed right from the beginning of when this became a scientific field, and perhaps right from beforehand, right? When like going right back through traditions, life emerging from the universe, the cosmos, has been quite a common idea in mythology. And then, as I say, when you get to the 1900s and people want a more specific explanation of the exact reactions or whatever that led to life, they immediately look at meteorites and stuff from space because they see it falling and they see it's full of organic molecules and it's full of similar molecules that's in life. And it almost seems like the universe is primed to give rise to life where the conditions allow it, which is an incredible thing. And it would really mean that we all derive literally from stardust, as Carl Sagan said, which I think, to me, as an earth scientist, I have strong, connections to thinking about environmentalism and thinking that we should be all treating each other with equality. And if we are all really just emerging from the same materials from the universe itself, all life on Earth, it seems crazy that we would exploit one another or exploit the environment in that way. It speaks to universalism, right? That's always something that I've said. People are like, oh, go and kill that wasp over there. Oh, I never, ever, ever want to do that, ever. I'd always put it out, even if it stung me, if possible, which I think my girlfriend finds very annoying. But at the end of the day, the current evidence suggests that we're all literally connected to the same point, to the origin of life itself, to one original organism. And so when you kill something else, you're killing a bit of yourself, really. And so that's that one thought. And the other one I have is that thinking about how life may have emerged from stuff from space and how life has behaved over its whole history is quite a big critique of the way we behave now as a civilization. Similar to how the origin of life got going with potentially these concentrated deposits of nutrients. Humans are looking for these concentrated deposits of nutrients to mine and keep everything going, keep the party going. But we don't recycle anything. We just assume that that's going to keep going forever. But we're trying to find an environment like that where the life can get going. It's really hard. We're not confident we've done it yet. Like this may or not be the answer. It could be something else. But it's not obvious that you can produce these deposits really easily. What life has done for the last 4.5 billion years is recycle like mad. It's developed these unbelievable strategies to deal with the fact that we live on a planet that's quite poor in all of the elements that life needs. And so we can extract these elements where it seems like it should be impossible. It can take N2, molecular nitrogen from the atmosphere with the triple bond. It's one of the hardest bonds to break in chemistry. And it's developed an enzyme, nitrogenase enzyme, to break that apart and get nitrogen, which allows you to have, infinitely more biomass than you would otherwise. And it's just unreal. It's unreal that biology is able to figure that out. And meanwhile, we just churn through the resources we have and dump them in the oceans and move on. And it can't end well. And so really there's a lesson from what we know about the origin of life and the history of life, which is that we need to be much more effective at reusing our resources and not just using everything up in the space of a few hundred years. Future generations won't thank us. Well, that might not answer the question, but that was what I had.
We'll be back after a break. The question is not an easy one, but I think you've answered it beautifully. What I really did want to hear was your own view on it. In fact, she also writes, and I didn't quote that, which is when she sees the meteorite, she calls it a rock that speaks of survival through the burdens of gravity, which I think a very beautiful, poetic way of putting it.
Yeah, and absolutely that is the case. That's why I love working with meteorites. Like I did a science communication workshop last week in Davos where we were handing people real meteorites to hold, not to keep, but just to hold. And everything about them speaks to that journey. As I say, the particles within them are bits of dust that were nearly destroyed by the sun as it was convulsing and coming to life. And then they've been cemented together and survived being separated from an asteroid in a huge collision. And then the whole crust of the meteorite is black, whereas the inside is pristine. And it's because the outside melted into what's called a fusion crust as it raced through the atmosphere. And then somehow it hit the surface and didn't blow up. And then it's in, our hands, 4 billion years after it formed. So yeah, everything about them speaks to this incredible durability. And it's a bit like us, right? We're all sitting here. And it's insane that that's the case because there's an unbroken genetic line between all of us that goes back all the way to one pond, probably on the Earth 4.5 billion years ago. It's just absolutely crazy.
Durability, intensity, and like you said, it also tells us something about time, because some of this that is reaching us from outer space, whether it be cosmic dust or an asteroid or a meteorite, it's also something to do with time, and it's out of time.
Yeah, well, I think it's kind of mind-boggling to think about how long is required for all of this, really. One thing that is incredible that maybe people don't think about so much is that life is almost as old as the solar system. Like the evidence suggests, although we can't know for certain because geologists, in order to know when things happened, we need rocks, and there are basically no rocks left from the first 500 million years of Earth's history. That's why we work so much with meteorites, because they're older than the Earth, so they allow us to sort of time travel beforehand and come at it from both angles. But that critical period of Earth's youth, when life appeared, we think we have no rocks. We just know that there's life in the oldest rocks, which are about 4 billion years. And the evidence is that the Earth became habitable pretty quickly after it formed. So if life appeared within the first 500 million years or at the beginning of that few first 100 million years or so, that just means that life is almost as old as the Earth and is therefore almost as old as the whole solar system. So as soon as our solar system formed, basically, you have life and life's been there for the whole ride. We're not some recent thing. We are durable, just like the meteorites.
Thank you. That's a great way to end that set of questions. And here I'm trying to connect my first question and the second one with an element that you have studied in your own PhD, which is phosphorus. It's one of those bioessential elements that's so important for life and also for the circle of life. It's the backbone of DNA. It's a critical ingredient in the structure and function of cells. It received a fiendish nickname as the devil's element in the 1600s, as a strange glowing substance with a habit of bursting into flames. It's also so important for global food production. In nature, phosphorus cycles through ecosystems in a mostly closed loop as organisms live, die, and decay, making it the elemental link that completes the circle of life. And I would really love to hear more about phosphorus because it is also something that we connect with waste in terms of it being part of the cycle of waste, but also something that is wasted through runoff and through fertilizer runoff in particular, also leading to algal blooms, which are becoming more and more prominent. So if you could tell us a little bit more about phosphorus, this wonderful element.
That's such a great question. So I spent a good 3.5 years thinking about phosphorus. In fact, my PhD thesis is called Phosphorus Pathways in Deep Time. So there's a good way of thinking about time, deep time. Just means on the scale of billions of years. And you're right to say that it has played all these really important roles in biology. So it forms a major constituent of cell walls. And as you say, it's in the backbone of DNA. It prevents the backbone of DNA from being subject to hydrolysis and also shuttling phosphate around between different molecules is basically how we regulate and execute metabolism. So your body is just going mental with phosphate right now. And when you eat food, you're importing a lot of phosphate and then burning it. And phosphate is also basically what allows our civilization to flourish as it does at the moment. Mining phosphate fertilizer every year and discovering new deposits of the stuff is what allows us to maintain such a huge population, which is why I worry when we simply dump it in the oceans. Because once it's there, life will use it up. As you say, you get these algal blooms, they'll die, and then they'll sink to the bottom. And it's very hard to get it back at that point. It's very expensive, and we haven't developed much technology to do so. And it would be environmentally costly to do so. And so I guess I have so many different thoughts on this. It's hard to know where to begin. One thing I'll hit you with is that the Oxford Classical Dictionary has an absolutely amazing definition of the word phosphorus, which is from my thesis. I've just got it open in front of me. Phosphorus, personification of the morning star, which announces the approach of dawn, and thus light bearer, bringer of the light of day. Which is pretty awesome. And it's because, as an element, as you say, when it's exposed to oxygen, it gives you this incredible burst of light, but also it's really important for life. So I think that classical definition, which is more theological, fits with how important the element is for life perfectly. And the reason I chose to focus on it in the PhD, and a lot of people are interested in it, is because it's not just that it's critical for life, because so is carbon, so is nitrogen, so is sulfur, as far as we know, but then it's one of the rarest of those elements. And also, it doesn't form a gas at the Earth's surface really at all, which means that the whole thing comes down specifically to geology. It comes down to minerals and the dissolution of those minerals. And often they're really hard to dissolve. That's one of the reasons that, for origins of life, cosmic dust is interesting because the phosphorus comes in a more reactive form than it would be normally on Earth. But that's not the only idea for where phosphorus comes from. But even putting that to the side, just across all of Earth history, how much phosphorus there's been at the surface in rocks and how efficiently that was being liberated into water for life to use really is the story of how and when life was able to flourish. So I did a whole project and towards the end of the PhD looking at trying to constrain that by measuring all different types of rocks and their ages. And it's fascinating. It turns out that in the Cambrian explosion, which maybe you've heard of when you first have animals and then they rapidly diversify and expand in biomass, the amount of phosphorus in Earth's crust, in the rocks that are available to life, tripled. So the cause and effect of this is still slightly open to debate. Now, was it the increase in phosphorus that led to the Cambrian explosion, or did the Cambrian explosion create the elements it needed to keep propelling itself forward? But either way, this dramatic event basically forged its own habitable environment. It massively increased and retained the elements that life and animals need to flourish in the places that it needs them to be. It's almost like this Gaia hypothesis. I'm not sure if you've heard of this, where the planet it's almost self-regulating. So it's just unreal that this happened at this time. What else can I say about phosphorus? Well, you mentioned algal blooms and the dangers, and it's interesting that you can have too much life. So when you pour phosphorus, which is the limiting nutrient, into the oceans, life can suddenly just explode, and you get these hungry microorganisms and algae, which start to use the phosphorus, and they form these massive blooms, as you say. And the danger comes from the fact that when they die, their bodies react with oxygen in the water. And if you've got so many cells that are all dying and reacting with oxygen, you can fully deplete the water column in oxygen, which will then kill any oxygen-breathing animals, which is basically everything. And this has happened many times throughout Earth history, where we have in the rock record, we have evidence of ocean anoxic events, which are full of organic matter, and they correlate with mass extinctions. And the problem is that these events can be self-sustaining, right? So the decay of the organic matter and using up the oxygen leads to more efficient release of phosphorus, which leads to more life, more biomass, more consumption of oxygen. I would say, frankly, it's probably one of the least well understood kind of runaway feedback processes that we know correlates with mass extinctions that there are. We all talk about volcanoes and asteroid impacts, but one of the ways in which these events ultimately kill everything in the oceans, because it's hard to get into the oceans. The oceans you'd think would be quite well preserved from something like that, is because you kill off so many things at the surface. They react with the oxygen and start this runaway process, and then you starve everything else of oxygen. So there is a question to be had as we just pump more and more and more fertilizer into the ocean is, how much would we need to put in to trigger something like this? I think more people should work on this. I really do. There's sort of like non-zero possibility that we could hit some critical threshold and then, suddenly a few years later, everything's dead.
It amazes me how many dystopian futures we can actually concoct.
Yeah, I mean, I'm more of an optimist. Maybe we can also talk about that before we finish. I do feel that the future will be like slightly better than a lot of times we think, just based on the history of humanity. We always think it's going to turn out horribly. And in some ways it does, but in other ways it doesn't. Like it's a mixed bag. Like for example, 100 years ago or so, everybody thought we were all going to starve. And that's because we hadn't figured out what life had figured out in getting access to nitrogen. We didn't know how to do nitrogen fixation. But then a slightly evil man called Haber came along and invented the Haber process. And that is how we fix nitrogen. Unfortunately, he also used his chemical genius to invent weapons of mass destruction for World War One, I think. But nonetheless, it did avert this impending famine. And nowadays, it's used everywhere to maintain enough nutrients for civilization. But the point is that, again, the ozone layer. We punched a hole in the ozone layer, but then we came together and now it's healing. So when things get really bad, humans are very good. What we suck at is being told it's going to get bad and caring. But in advance, we're just the worst. We're purely reactive. We suck at planning. And so I'm hoping that the same thing will be true with things I've talked about and with climate change, where, as you start to hit the crunch, humans suddenly care much more than they ever did before, and then they're able to reverse things or improve the situation, which means that the future isn't totally predictable. Human ingenuity is quite vast. When it's really channeled, we can do incredible things. I mean, the problem is that we're already doing a lot of damage to the environment. Human progress really has come at the cost of the environment so far. And so a more fundamental question is not just whether or not we can make it fine for ourselves, but whether or not we can come up with a way of living that's fine for everything else as well. And that's maybe a bigger challenge.
Thank you, Craig. And here I was also thinking about how, especially when it comes to extraction and minerals, it also has all these geopolitical ramifications, right? So when I was reading about phosphorus and I realized the largest reserve of phosphate is in Morocco, and especially in the region of the Western Sahara, where you have huge geopolitical issues.
Absolutely. You're so right. Have you seen the aerial footage of that mine?
No, I haven't. I haven't.
Because it's just this big hole in the ground and then a really long line of like train carts just going in a completely straight line across the desert just constantly. And yeah, you're right that if I think the nation wanted to blow that up, it'd be really easy. I don't know why you would want to like cause a global famine, but there's not very many places worldwide where you have these concentrated deposits that I mentioned of phosphate. It's rare, broadly speaking. And what they're mining there is a rock called phosphorite. These rocks form when life, under very specific circumstances, concentrates phosphorus to a crazy degree in coastlines. But this doesn't happen very often. Like it's not the norm. And so there's not an infinite number of these that we can turn to. So if some got shot down, or even if we just used them all up, my question really to the international community is what are we going to do when we can't do that? We can't do that forever. We can't. I mean, it's possible that for the next 100 years, we'll continuously find other workable deposits and keep doing this inefficient thing. But just dumping it all in the oceans with no recycling is madness. It's madness because then you're going to be stuck with a thousandfold less efficient sources. And it means you're going to have to come up with something that's a thousandfold more efficient than before. And that's not easy. It's really not easy. That's what life is doing, but life has had billions of years to randomly use evolution to figure this out. We have to be careful. That said, they did just find a really big one in Norway. Very lucky, Norway, like they're about to get even richer. But I still feel like it's a dangerous way to go. And especially given it could be the catalyst for some major conflict, I think. Because right now Russia, for example, has huge phosphate mines, but those are starting to slowly run out. And you could imagine in a kind of polarized world, if one group of nations is able to restrict access to what you need to grow food to another, that's a recipe for disaster, right? So we'll see how it all turns out.
Thank you so much, Craig. It's just been so fascinating talking about all of this with you. And maybe you can share some parting thoughts. It could be about the research that you're doing and the research that's ongoing. I know you write some science fiction. It could be anything, something you could leave us with, a few parting thoughts.
A few parting thoughts. Okay, I've got two for you. One is that my most recent project isn't about the origins of life. It's about the chances of finding life elsewhere. And what I've found is that Earth falls into a Goldilocks zone in terms of its phosphorus. So it's not just great in terms of having liquid water and the right type of radiation from the sun and the right atmosphere, but also it has enough phosphorus. Turns out that many other planets probably don't. And it's another filter, which means that our chances of finding life out there is lower, especially for finding species like us that have had long enough to become super intelligent, sometimes at least. But the positive spin on this, which I'm really excited about, which I think people should think about, is that the chances are getting higher and higher that we could be the first. When you watch a science fiction movie and you see these ancient civilizations that have been there and done it and they're super wise and they rule the galaxy, or they're really evil, that could be us. We could be that elder species and we're just the first on the scene, which means we have a vast responsibility to figure out what we're doing to each other, to the planet, and potentially to the whole galaxy. So it's just amazing to think that that could be our position in the history of our galaxy. It could be quite an important one, just by chance. So, and also it would imply that there's not this statistical paradox of, well, there's loads of planets and there's no life, so we're probably all going to die. Maybe if we're the first, there's no reason to think that's true. We should act with due, optimism and try and make sure that we make it. So that's one parting thought. And the other one is, yeah, I've been writing science fiction even longer than I've been doing science, but I've only just started putting it online for people to judge. So if people do want to, go on Twitter or X and follow me or go on Amazon and check it out, that would be fun. If anybody wants to email me, I'm very open to critical feedback, very much so.
Thank you so much, Craig. We'll make sure that we put out the link when we put the episode notes together.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much. That was a great conversation.
Thank you so much, Craig. Thanks to Dr. Craig Walton for sharing his thoughts with us. The Subverse is the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. You can follow us on Instagram at Dark and Light Zine. If you like the show, please tell a friend and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. The Subverse is produced for us by Waka Media. Some housekeeping. The Subverse will be on an extended summer break and return later in the year with our remaining episodes. In July, ARCS will return for its third series with some exciting conversations on South Asian speculative fiction authors and what inspires them. So long, and thanks for listening.